Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcasts, and others of you are joining us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. Tonight, racial generational trauma. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We are working with limited staff, and our guests are joining us remotely. It started before the people of African descent arrived on these shores, trauma to the psyche and spirit, exacerbated through the dehumanizing years of slavery, years when successive generations of African Americans passed on their despair and pain. Social scientists now link the communal harm to the post-traumatic stress disorder suffered by recent and current generations of people of color. And can there be healing if the source of the trauma never goes away? Joining us, Gary Bailey, therapist and Assistant Dean for Community Engagement and Social Justice at the College of Social Science, Policy and Practice at Simmons University. Dr. C. Sean McGuffey, Associate Professor of Sociology and the Director of African and African Diaspora Studies at Boston College. Kim McLaren, Associate Professor and Graduate Program Director of Writing, Literature, and Publishing at Emerson College. And Dr. Charles Daniels, therapist and founder of Fathers Uplift, an organization aimed at helping men transition into fatherhood. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Gary, I'm going to start with you. When you hear racial generational trauma, you're trying to get your head around it. But what I've come to learn from preparing for this show is that it's not psychological only, it's also physiological, and something called epigenetics has a part to play. Would you please describe what that is?
Sure. Epigenetics really comes out of the work of Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who was at the Cleveland Clinic and at Mount Sinai Hospital, and she's one of the leading experts in post-traumatic stress disorder. And what she began to investigate and interrogate was looking at the impact of trauma on genetics and really beginning to think about trauma as a genetic marker. And her entree into looking at this work was through survivors, she's Jewish, and looking at survivors of the Holocaust and really seeing correlations between survivors and then intergenerational trauma and impact on genetic markers across the survivors. I remember listening to her work once with Krista Tippett and a discussion on her show On Being, driving to the Cape and literally pulling my car over because I thought this is, if we're talking about the impact of trauma as it relates to the Holocaust, what then does this look like in terms of thinking about 400 years of trauma on genetic markers and what has been passed down across generations? And the piece that we don't talk about is what happened with people who were being mated, if you will, to create new supplies of bodies. So trauma, being mated with trauma, being passed across generations explains a lot about what has happened 18, 19 generations later in terms of the numbing, depression, the challenges around building intimate relationships. What I talk about is the flattened affect as a presentation of trauma. And the work of Resmaa Menakem, who takes Dr. Yehuda's work even further, talks about what happens when trauma becomes culture. So that what we talk about as being a cultural norm really is what trauma looks like in action in the here and now.
Let me pick up a little bit of that with you, Sean, and that is Gary just gave us a sense of some of what we would see, out here in the world if we see traumatized people who are folks who are inheritors, if you will, of racial trauma. What else would you say is something that demonstrates that?
Well, we see lots of PTSD syndrome symptoms within racial trauma, anxiety, arousal, avoidance techniques, things that you will see with other forms of trauma. And I think part of the issue to think about is like, what is not only the impact of this trauma, but is producing this trauma? Like, how do we think about racial trauma not only as an individual impact, but the structures that produce these sort sorts of trauma that we have coming. So part of what my own work looks at too is like what produces trauma. So not only what are the symptoms of trauma, well, what is actually producing trauma through generations of trauma being like the structure of your community, the structure of your neighborhood, the structure of the healthcare system, the structure of our policing system, and then how that produces very similar symptomology as people who experience other forms of complex trauma, which is trauma that's not just one time but happens over and over and over again, and then witnessing that trauma and then passing on that witnessing to other generations as well.
So, Kim, let's talk about how you experience then. So we're talking about this generational trauma being transferred down and becoming a part of the culture. So whether or not you're even aware of it, it's inherent, it's now embedded in the DNA, but now it's also cultural to be traumatized. How have you experienced that?
Oh boy. Yeah, this is such an important topic and it's so complex. And I see this is something I think a lot about because I see it in my students. I worry about it with young people and students of color and particularly Black students in a predominantly white institution, which otherwise might not seem as bad as other institutions or certainly historically. And yet their reactiveness to quote unquote minor incidents is huge. And I think that's part of what's happening here, right? Mm-hmm. Somebody says something and it wounds them in a way that might seem outsized to the reaction. But I think that's part of what's going on is this generational trauma, right? It's being passed on. It's like a sword that never heals. And so it's being constantly picked at. And I think it's particularly challenging for young people. Those of us who have survived, quite frankly, if you survive past middle age, you have to develop a mechanism for coping with this, right? For handling it. Some healthy mechanisms, some very unhealthy mechanisms we have in our culture. But the fact that we're even able to survive is phenomenal. It's just astonishing. But it does cost us. It costs us, in coping mechanisms. And my own one used to be anger, So this is I'm almost overwhelmed with this conversation because it's so deep. So I'll stop there.
Mm-hmm. Charles, part of the cultural piece of this, as I see it, is something that all of us were re-traumatized by this past summer. We're looking at George Floyd's knee on the neck, dying. We're looking at more and more incidences. We know they're going on all the time, but incidents of unarmed Black men, Black women like Breonna Taylor dying at the hands of police. She just trying to sleep in her house. But your particular program, Fathers Uplift, really is dealing with trying to make that connection between fathers and their sons and fatherhood. And as I'm hearing everybody speak, I can see now how that generational trauma really disrupts that connectivity. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. As one of our clients called it, he says, Charles, it's like having a black reflex. Every time you see yourself walking down the street or you think about your children, if they're in school, you're thinking about, hey, are they going to lose their life? So we all have experienced trauma vicariously through witnessing these horrible experiences through our television screens. But at the end of the day, it really keeps you on edge as a Black father, as a Black parent in general. I can say that over the past few months, there's also a lot of fathers considering whether or not they're going to have children due to what they're experiencing. I mean, you're thinking about your kids who are not even here yet, especially for many fathers who are currently expecting. The question is, honey, are you sure you want to move forward with this pregnancy? Are you sure you could bring a child into the world right now as a Black man and woman? Because you are so afraid of that life that child is going to have once they're born. So not only are you experiencing a Black reflex, you see the police, your livelihood, worried about your kids while they're in school, you're also considering whether or not you want to bring kids into this mess that we're currently experiencing today. So these are real life situations that many individuals are thinking about as they are bringing kids into this world. And even for men currently who have kids, is my kid going to be safe when I leave this earth? And that's a big question we all have to answer.
So let's take a look at this 2016 episode from the television series Blackish, which underscores what a lot of you have said. The family here is discussing police brutality and the perceptions of how people of color are viewed, along with the fear and the reality Black and brown parents have for their children.
Let's say they listen to the cops and get in the car. Look what happened to Freddie Gray.
Yeah, and what if they make it all the way to the station? You remember Sandra Bland?
And let's say they do make it to trial. You see where that gets us? Don't you get it, Bo? The system is rigged against us.
Maybe it is, Dre. But I don't want to feel like my kids are living in a world that is so flawed that they can't have any hope.
Oh, so you want to talk about hope, Bo? Obama ran on hope. Remember when he got elected? And we felt like maybe, just maybe, we got out of that bad place and made it to a good place. That the whole country was really ready to turn the corner. You remember that amazing feeling we had during the inauguration? I was sitting right next to you. And we were so proud. And we saw him get out of that limo and walk alongside of it and wave to that crowd. Tell me you weren't terrified when you saw that. Tell me you weren't worried that someone was going to snatch that hope away from us like they always do. That is the real world, Bo. And our children need to know that that's the world that they live in.
So, Sean, that's an example of generational trauma. Look at all those generations in that room as they were discussing it. Pretty powerful.
Yes, and that's that moment there. That's a show called Blackish, but a lot of non-Black people watch that show too. And I think it gave an insight to what a lot of Black people feel on a daily basis, especially in the, what now, thank goodness, post-Trump era, like what that would look like how you navigate this world, how you're almost afraid to have joy because you don't know when that joy is going to be snatched away from you. And that's really powerful. And I think when you think about the social consequences of being afraid to have joy because of the generations of racial trauma that you experience, because we know joy in the social science data, joy can help your physical health, it can help your mental health, it helps your interactions with other people. And when you're afraid to have joy, like what does that do for your interactions? And especially when he's talking about your interactions with your very children, people that you're trying to live in this world where, I don't know other people here, but I was raised with this dualism. My parents were like, you can be whatever you want to be. You're this wonderful human being. And I grew up in a very blackness around me and said that you are a beautiful Black child. You have all this potential. But at the same time, they're like, fuck. Be careful because there's all these limitations and constraints on you. And so I don't think that growing up, where your parents say you can be whatever you want to be. However, there's an asterisk there. You're going to have to work harder. You got to do this. You have to be careful. You have to comport yourself differently. When you go off to that white college, you can't do all the things that those white students are doing because it's going to impact you differently. And I think these are really important moments to think about how Black people learn not only navigate safety, but how do you navigate your mental health, your social health? How do you navigate learning to live that full life? How do you simultaneously embrace Black joy and Black concern at the same time? And the way I was raised, you kind of have to do that. You have to juggle them both at the same time.
Right. I want to come back to that, but before I move forward, Gary, I want you to make something clear, and that is the sustained trauma, the everyday, the multiplicity of incidents, the duality that Sean talked about of trying to balance all this stuff. We've talked about it's now in the DNA. Well, it also results in today's social determinant health determinant rather, about, translating it into bad health for folks of color. Right. And I want you to make that case. Please explain that.
I mean, it's really important to understand that what I refer to, and I use a different language around the social determinants because it sounds, as someone with a public health focus, it sounds as if it's fixed and unremutable. I talk about the social factors of health. Those are changeable. They are not fixed. We created them. We can undo them. So the social factors are really important to understand that they are like fissures and cracks. And it is never surprising in times of crisis that viruses, and, COVID is one, police, I think is another, police brutality, extrajudicial killings is another kind of virus, that we can keep, AIDS was another virus. We can keep naming all of these things that disproportionately impact Black and brown communities: asthma, heart disease, stroke, amputations, depression, all of those things. That those viruses, those cracks get filled in by the viruses because it exposes and creates vulnerabilities. And viruses are really smart. They go to the path of least resistance. They are opportunistic. The whole definition of an opportunistic infection is it goes to the places where your guard is down. And some of our guard is down as Black and brown folks. It's historic. We have been, part of the ways in which you control is by creating fear. And that fear has to be passed down. Fear becomes the rule. And you need to tell your people how they need to behave around me so that they understand what the rules are. And in a Machiavellian way, I then need to make examples of some of you to understand that the rules are still fixed and clear. Mm-hmm. So it may not be my grandpapa, but watching those people scale the walls of the Capitol on January 6th, was reestablishing the rules. Mm-hmm. There will be no accountability. We'll be able to walk away and you can't do it. And there's no way that if you didn't get that intellectually, you got it in your gut that said the rules are different for them.
So now I want to go back to something that Sean began to talk about, which was joy as a way of interfering, of interrupting rather. The potential consequences, the long-term consequences, certainly the generational consequences. Kim, you've talked about insisting during this really traumatic time of last year and continuing that you were going to focus on joy as a matter of self-care. And you understand that to be almost a political act.
It absolutely is a political act. I mean, it's so vitally important. And this is where I get really concerned. I mean, there's so much concern about this conversation, but I mentioned to someone that I have heard the word trauma come out of the mouths of Black students more in the past 5 years than I have previously. And some of this is an awareness, and the awareness and the acceptance and the acknowledgement of the very real racial trauma we live with is vitally important. But I worry that for young people, they then begin to internalize that sense of constantly being traumatized and on the receiving end and on the defensive end. And that in itself begins to, kind of perpetuate, right? I mean, there's very real stuff we're living with. I am not diminishing that. But as Gary was talking about, the fear and and as Sean was talking about the kind of always being in a defensive crouch, right? I mean, that just makes things worse. So I'm not saying either or, it's like both. So I have here's my mantra, and some people appreciate it, some people don't. It's a quote from Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael said, if a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If he has the power to lynch me, that's my problem. Right. And so for me, that actually is very liberating, right? Because there are very real ways in which this trauma impacts my life if people have power. But if it's a question of attitude, I can defend myself against the attitudinal aspects of this trauma. And I can do that by incorporating joy and celebrating our resilience and our creativity. I teach a class in Black revolutionary thought, Black literature, revolutionary literature. We read slave narratives and trauma. I mean, it's all traumatic. But I start each class with, Mahalia Jackson singing, or yesterday, the Nicholas brothers dancing in stormy weather, right? Because I want my students to know there is Black joy and Black creativity and Black celebration along with this. It's not either or, but I think it's really important to emphasize, right? We are amazing, and we this is real. But I hear what everybody's saying, last thing, just what Charles was saying about Black fathers. Think about a Black mother who's carrying a baby and and the traumatic impact. So this is real. I thought about this when I was pregnant. Like you're literally transmitting this trauma into the fetus. So this is real. But that's when I took up Black joy. Okay, because I can't be passing this on directly through my uterus to my children, right?
So, Charles, with that, you are yourself and dealing with a group of people who are literally the physical embodiment of the traumatic attacks, if you will, and who are also dealing with the constant messages that you are not worthy. So how do you intervene and interrupt that and bring the joy, which, as all of you have said, is really what has to be in order to sort of stop the passing on of this trauma?
That's a great question. And, I really would like to tell you that we do what Dr. Bailey did for me when I was on the verge of graduating or dropping out of Simmons University because I did not understand how to navigate racism in the Northeast as opposed to racism in the South. And I'm going to tell you what Dr. Bailey did. Dr. Bailey said, you're going to graduate. He validated my experiences. And more importantly, he validated my Blackness. Then after that, he surrounded me into a community of Black scholars that looked like me who could pour into me. And if he had not done that, I would not be Dr. Charles Daniels Jr. today. So what our men need, Black men as well as our Black women need, is community. They need to know that they're important. They also need to know that what they're experiencing, when they believe that they are experiencing racism, yes, you're experiencing racism. But also, like Dr. Bailey told me, yes, you're right, Charles, but you also can overcome it and not become a product of it. And I think as Black men and women, sometimes we are so paralyzed by racism that we don't know that we need community. And I think it is our responsibility to say, if someone brings us into the community, to embrace that community. And at the same time, know that we're important and we deserve to be here in the United States of America, wherever we are, or wherever we may be experiencing racism. So that's what we do at Fathers Uplift. But I want to tell you, we could not have done that if it was not done for me when I came here in the city of Boston.
So how important is it to validate? So this is going to sound contradictory back to what you said originally, Sean, trying to live in this duality. The validation of what is happening, because, when these videos started popping up and, President Obama was in office, I remember, and one of them happened and he said, Black folks are not making this up. This happens. But yet you didn't have the validation from the larger community, the larger American community as we know it. So how is it important to have that validation, but at the same time, understanding that if you have the validation, it re-traumatizes? Sean.
Validation is such a complicated theory and ideas, but no matter we're looking at it within like political science and recognition theory or sociology, associations theories, that it's important. The question is though what we do with it, because like whether you're looking, no matter what trauma, be racial, generational trauma, sexual assault, DV. If you do not validate the experience of the person experiencing the trauma, it re-traumatizes the person. And sometimes that re-traumatization can have a deeper psychological impact than the actual trauma. So if you don't believe the victim, whether it be a sexual assault victim or a racialized trauma victim, that not believing and not validating experience can have really deep social and psychological impact. So it must be there. We need to create these communities like Charles was saying, what Charles got from Gary, create these communities where you can actually do that and where you're going to get this validation from your experiences to move on. At the same time, we have to be careful because we're oftentimes not going to get that validation from the wider community, and we must protect ourselves against that as well. So this I think is the complexity of navigating racism and generational racial trauma. We know it works. We know validation works, but we know as Black people in this country, we're not going to get a lot of that validation. So how do we put systems in place to get that validation? So it's really complex. I wish we could just say, yes, validate the experiences and we go on because that's what the social science says we should do. But we know that's not likely to happen on a wider grand scale. I mean, we can't even get an apology for slavery yet from the United States government, right? So like we have to think about how do we cultivate space? How do we recognize that validation is important, cultivate spaces where we can get some validation, but still having a resilience. This is where I bring in that Black joy again, where if we don't get it from that wider community, we're still going to be okay. And so we need to really address it all, the macro, the meso, and the micro levels, because we're not all going to get all of it on any of those one of the individual levels. We have to constantly surround ourselves by it. One of the things I do, like all the classes I teach are on violence, whether it be sexual assault, police violence, genocide. But I make sure that Black joy is an essential part of all of my classes because despite my research topics, I'm a pretty happy person. I think most people tell you that Sean's a pretty happy guy, despite and I study the underbelly of society. And the reason that I do this, I cultivate Black joy in my daily life. And what I try to do to my students, as well as my research assistants, is say, yes, this is what we're studying, but what did you do today to make yourself happy? What did you do today to cultivate joy and put the processes in place to cultivate that joy, because you're not going to get the validation you need every single day.
That is a great place for us to end right now. I want to thank you for that. This is the end of our broadcast, the end of the show. Thank you to all of my guests, and thank you for joining us. Stay with us as we continue our conversation on Facebook and Twitter.